While the entire world was obsessively watching the endless drama of a self-exiled prince across the ocean and meticulously calculating the astronomical wealth of the future king, something entirely different and utterly shocking was happening behind the heavy velvet curtains of Buckingham Palace. A quiet revolution of inheritance was taking place, carefully orchestrated by Queen Elizabeth herself in her final years. The media completely missed it. The public had no idea, and certain high-ranking members of the royal family, especially the current queen consort, were left absolutely stunned. Imagine this. What if I told you that the royal who benefited the most profoundly from the late queen's private estate wasn't the future king of England, nor the glamorous Princess of Wales, but a young woman who recently spent her summer earning minimum wage working at a local garden center? This is the untold story of Lady Louise Windsor. At 22 years old, she is the granddaughter you might barely recognize. Yet she is the one who quietly walked away with the most precious, sentimental, and fiercely contested pieces of the royal legacy. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on a secret favoritism that the House of Windsor tried to keep completely under wraps. If you think you know how the royal wealth was divided, prepare to have everything you thought you knew completely overturned. To truly understand why Lady Louise was entrusted with such monumental inheritances, we have to go back 2 decades to a desperately cold day in November 2003. The story of her royal inheritance does not begin with gold or titles. It begins with a terrifying fight for survival. The birth of Lady Louise Alice Elizabeth Mary Mountbatten Windsor was not a standard royal delivery surrounded by meticulous planning and cheering crowds. It was a chaotic, blood-soaked medical emergency that shook the royal family to its core. Her mother, Sophie, the Countess of Wessex, was suddenly stricken with a severe placental abruption. This is a catastrophic medical event where the placenta detaches from the womb, cutting off the baby's oxygen supply and causing massive internal bleeding for the mother. The situation was so dire that Sophie had to be rushed by ambulance to Frimley Park Hospital. There was no time for royal protocols. There was no time to wait. Louise's father, Prince Edward, the Queen's youngest son, was thousands of miles away on an official tour in Mauritius. He was entirely helpless, receiving frantic updates across the globe, completely unaware if his wife or his unborn child would survive the night. In a frantic race against the clock, surgeons performed an emergency cesarean section. Both mother and baby lost dangerous amounts of blood. When little Louise was finally pulled into the world, she was a tiny, fragile, premature infant, hovering right on the very edge of life. She was immediately ripped away from her mother and rushed to a specialized neonatal intensive care unit at St. George's Hospital in London. For days, the entire royal household held its collective breath. This agonizing, touch-and-go start to life created an immediate, profound shift in Queen Elizabeth. The monarch, often seen by the public as stoic, traditional, and sometimes emotionally distant from her older children, developed an incredibly fierce, protective instinct over this vulnerable little girl. That near-tragic night forged an invisible, unbreakable thread between the sovereign and her youngest granddaughter, a thread that would ultimately dictate the distribution of the Queen's most cherished private possessions. As Louise grew, she faced even more hurdles. The complications from her premature birth left her with a severe condition called esotropia, which caused her eyes to turn inward. She endured multiple corrective surgeries throughout her early childhood. Every hospital visit, every surgery, only deepened the grandparents' devotion. While Prince William and Prince Harry were thrust into the unforgiving glare of the global spotlight, burdened by the heavy expectations of the crown and the tragic legacy of their mother, Lady Louise was allowed to simply be a child. She was sheltered, protected, and quietly cherished. Palace insiders have whispered for years about this unspoken dynamic. Because Louise and her younger brother James were separated in age by many years from their older cousins, they brought out a soft, tender, maternal side of the Queen that the public almost never witnessed. They didn't have to perform for the cameras. They didn't have to navigate bitter tabloid wars. Instead, their relationship was built on the quiet, muddy grounds of the Balmoral estate. While other royals were busy managing their public relations, Louise was spending lazy afternoons at Windsor, sitting on the sofa with her grandmother, eating biscuits, and watching simple children's television shows like Mr. Tumble. She was the granddaughter who didn't even realize her grandmother was the Queen of England until she went to school. To Louise, Elizabeth was never Her Majesty. She was just Grandma. It was this profound innocence, this absolute lack of entitlement, and this pure, uncalculated love that captured the monarch's heart. And as the Queen entered the twilight of her historic reign, surrounded by family scandals, bitter feuds, and endless public scrutiny, she made a silent promise to herself. She decided exactly who would inherit the purest pieces of her legacy. The stage was set for a private transfer of wealth and history that no one saw coming, a decision that would soon spark intense jealousy and a quiet war behind closed palace doors. To comprehend the sheer magnitude of what Lady Louise ultimately inherited, we must first look at a deeply moving, solitary moment that captured the attention of the entire globe. The date was April 9th, 2021. The royal family, and indeed the world, was mourning the loss of its fiercely independent patriarch, Prince Philip, who had passed away at the remarkable age of 99. During his televised funeral at Windsor Castle, amidst the perfectly synchronized military marches, the somber music, and the heavy grief of a widowed queen, there was one specific, breathtakingly quiet scene that broke the hearts of millions. It was a visual so poignant, yet so utterly devoid of traditional royal pomp, that it stood out as the most powerful moment of the entire ceremony. Standing perfectly still in the pristine quadrangle were two beautiful, dark fell ponies named Balmoral Nevis and Knotlaw Storm. Behind them rested a meticulously crafted, dark green four-wheeled riding carriage. But it was what lay resting entirely empty on the carriage seat that told the true story. Carefully placed, there were a worn driving cap, a pair of worn brown leather driving gloves, a finely crafted whip, and a simple, red plastic tub filled with sugar lumps. These items did not belong to the state. They did not belong to the crown. They were the intensely personal, beloved tools of a man who had spent his life navigating the rigid confines of royalty by escaping into the wild, untamed rhythm of horse driving. This specific carriage, those loyal ponies, and the legacy of the sport itself were not passed down to the future king, Prince Charles. They were not given to the global superstars, Prince William or Prince Harry. They were handed directly and exclusively to the quietest, most unassuming grandchild, Lady Louise. To understand why this inheritance was so profoundly significant, you have to understand Prince Philip's obsessive dedication to the sport. After severe arthritis forced him to abandon his beloved sport of polo, he did not simply retire to an armchair. Instead, in 1971, he took up competitive carriage driving. He did not just participate, he dominated. He represented Great Britain in 6 world championships and 3 European championships, fiercely competing well into his 80s. It was his sanctuary, his obsession, and his ultimate expression of freedom. But as the years crept up on him, the Duke of Edinburgh began looking for an heir to this unique passion. He found it in the young girl who had fought so hard just to survive her birth. The grandfather and granddaughter forged an unbreakable, magical bond out in the sprawling, misty fields of Windsor Great Park. Away from the flashing cameras and the suffocating palace protocols, they personally taught Louise the incredibly difficult, physically demanding art of controlling a team of horses. They spent countless, quiet hours together, communicating in the shared language of reins, subtle movements, and deep mutual respect. Her mother, Sophie, once noted that Louise possessed a rare, natural talent for the sport. But it was more than just talent. It was a profound connection to her grandfather's spirit. Philip recognized that Louise, despite her early visual impairments and shy demeanor, possessed his exact same quiet, steely determination. The carriage that stood at his funeral was actually his latest model, custom-built to his exact, demanding specifications, pouring decades of his engineering knowledge into the metal and wood. Leaving this specific carriage to Louise was not a mere transfer of an asset recorded by a cold palace lawyer. It was the ultimate passing of the torch. It was a grandfather handing his soul over to the only person he trusted to carry it forward. The proof of his brilliant foresight came rapidly. In 2019, Philip, frail but beaming with an unmistakable, fierce pride, sat in the stands and watched his teenage granddaughter compete in the private driving singles at the Royal Windsor Horse Show, where she triumphantly secured 3rd place. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy for the aging patriarch. Then came the emotional climax that cemented her place in the family's history. In 2022, a year after his death, Lady Louise took the reins of that very same dark green carriage. She drove it masterfully at the Royal Windsor Horse Show, leading an emotional parade that brought the entire arena to a standstill. Up in the stands sat Queen Elizabeth, as the monarch watched the young girl expertly handle the carriage, embodying the exact spirit of the man she had loved for over 7 decades. Tears visibly glistened in the Queen's eyes. It was a moment of profound closure and immense pride. Louise had not just inherited a wooden cart and 2 ponies, she had inherited the fiercely independent heartbeat of the Duke of Edinburgh. By 2024, she was competing at the British National Carriage Driving Championships, clinching second place in her fiercely competitive class, entirely under the royal surname of Mountbatten Windsor. This beautiful, undisputed inheritance from Prince Philip set a monumental precedent. It proved that the sovereign grandparents were more than willing to completely bypass the direct line of succession to reward pure loyalty, genuine passion, and deep personal connection. It was a beautiful passing of a grandfather's legacy. However, when Queen Elizabeth began plotting the distribution of her own monumental private wealth, she followed Philip's exact philosophy of favoring the loyal over the entitled. But unlike a wooden carriage and a tub of sugar lumps, the Queen's personal estate involved priceless jewels, sprawling castles, and unbelievable fortunes. And her decisions were about to light a match of resentment that would set the highest ranks of the royal family completely ablaze. While Prince Philip's touching gift of a wooden carriage and 2 fell ponies represented the beautiful, sentimental transfer of a grandfather's sporting legacy, the inheritance left behind by Queen Elizabeth was an entirely different beast. To truly understand the brewing storm of jealousy and the shockwaves that ripped through the House of Windsor following her death, we must first shatter a massive, fatal misunderstanding that the general public holds about royal wealth. When most people think of the British monarchy, they envision one gigantic, bottomless vault of gold, castles, and land, seamlessly handed down from one generation to the next. But that is a profound illusion. The reality of royal finances is fiercely divided by an invisible, impenetrable legal wall. On one side lies the immense, staggering wealth of the institution. On the other side lies the fiercely guarded, highly secretive personal fortune of the woman who wore the crown. And it is within that second, private fortune where the real power, the real favoritism, and the real palace drama ultimately reside. First, let us look at the institutional wealth, known officially as the Crown Estate. This is an astronomical, mind-boggling portfolio of lands, properties, and holdings estimated to be worth around $28 billion. It includes some of the most famous landmarks on the planet, such as Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and Kensington Palace, along with massive tracts of prime real estate stretching across central London and the ocean seabed. But here is the critical catch. Almost none of that $28 billion personally belonged to Queen Elizabeth. The Crown Estate is managed by an independent public board. It belongs to the monarchy as an ongoing, eternal institution, not to the individual monarch sitting on the throne. The Queen could not simply decide to sell Buckingham Palace or gift a wing of Windsor Castle to her favorite granddaughter. She was merely the temporary custodian of these monumental assets. When she drew her final breath, the keys to that $28 billion empire automatically and immediately passed to her eldest son, King Charles, by absolute right of succession. There was no debate, no will to read, and no room for personal preference. However, hiding entirely in the shadows of the Crown Estate was Queen Elizabeth's secondary empire, her vast, private, personal fortune. This was money and property that she owned outright, completely free from the grasp of the government or the institutional monarchy. At the time of her passing, financial experts estimated her private net worth to be hovering around an astonishing £500 million. Unlike the official royal palaces, this immense private wealth included real estate that her family had purchased with their own money generations ago. Chief among these were 2 monumental properties. The first was Balmoral Castle in Scotland, a sprawling, majestic Highland fortress deeply beloved by the Queen, valued at roughly £80 million. The second was the Sandringham Estate in Norfolk, a massive, luxurious winter retreat worth approximately £250 million. Because these properties were privately owned, Elizabeth had the absolute, terrifying power to do whatever she wanted with them. But her private wealth did not stop at castles. Over her unprecedented 7-decade reign, she had quietly amassed a jaw-dropping collection of thoroughbred racehorses, a fleet of extremely rare private vintage motorcars, a vast archive of priceless royal stamp collections, and a highly secretive portfolio of stock market investments that financial insiders estimate could easily exceed £100 million when fully adjusted for long-term market growth. This immense pile of private wealth gave the Queen ultimate leverage. But there was a massive legal hurdle she had to navigate: the dreaded British inheritance tax. Under standard law, any massive transfer of wealth is heavily taxed by the government. However, thanks to a highly controversial and incredibly lucrative legal agreement struck with the British government back in 1993, Transfers of wealth from one sovereign directly to the next sovereign are entirely exempt from the punishing 40% inheritance tax. This meant that to protect the bulk of her £500 million fortune from being slashed nearly in half by the taxman, Elizabeth had no choice but to leave the absolute lion's share of her wealth directly to King Charles. It was a matter of preserving the dynasty's financial power. But the Queen was brilliantly strategic. She knew that while the bulk of the money in the massive estates had to go to Charles for tax purposes, her private, movable assets, the items of true, intensely personal, and historical value, did not. She had the absolute right to distribute her favorite, most cherished possessions to whomever she pleased before she died, completely bypassing the traditional, rigid lines of royal succession. And that is exactly what she did. In July 2022, just 2 short months before her devastating passing, deep, persistent whispers began leaking out of the palace. A highly placed source revealed to media outlets that the frail monarch was spending her final days meticulously going through her private inventories. She was actively determining exactly who truly deserved what. She was making highly calculated, deeply personal, last-minute changes to her private bequests. She was looking past the heirs who had brought scandal, noise, and tabloid embarrassment to her doorstep. Instead, she was looking toward the quiet, loyal, completely unproblematic members of her family, like the young Lady Louise and her parents. The Queen was using her absolute power over her private possessions to send a deafeningly loud message from beyond the grave about who she truly valued. These final, highly secretive choices sparked an immediate, furious backlash among certain senior members of the royal family who felt they were owed far more. The battle lines were silently drawn, and the first major casualty of this inheritance war was about to center around the most glittering, fiercely contested prize of all, the Queen's legendary private collection of diamonds. If the story of the green carriage was a touching tale of a grandfather's love, the story of Queen Elizabeth's private jewelry collection is a masterclass in royal psychological warfare. When the dust finally settled after the monumental state funeral, and the heavy, gilded doors of Buckingham Palace were firmly shut to the public, the true battle over the Queen's estate began. And the first major casualty of this silent, vicious inheritance war centered around a treasure trove so magnificent it almost defies human comprehension. We are not talking about the official crown jewels, which are strictly locked away under heavy armed guard at the Tower of London and belong entirely to the state. We are talking about the Queen's fiercely guarded, intimately personal collection of diamonds, pearls, rubies, and sapphires. This was a breathtaking archive consisting of over 300 individual, historically priceless pieces. Financial experts and royal historians have conservatively estimated the sheer market value of this private collection to be worth an eye-watering $110 million. For decades, the women of the royal family had quietly coveted these pieces. But as Queen Elizabeth approached the very end of her historic reign, she made a highly calculated, devastatingly clear decision about exactly who would inherit the absolute lion's share of this $110 million fortune. She did not divide it equally. She did not pass it down the chain of command. Instead, reports confirmed that she bypassed almost everyone and left the vast majority of her most valuable, sentimental pieces directly to Catherine, the Princess of Wales. This was an unprecedented, staggering gift. It was the ultimate, glittering endorsement from the dying monarch. It proved that Elizabeth saw Kate not just as a reliable working royal, but as the absolute future and the true matriarchal savior of the House of Windsor. However, this beautiful gesture of trust ignited an inferno of anger in another, very powerful corner of the palace. Enter the new queen consort, Camilla. To fully grasp the bitter resentment brewing in the shadows, you must understand the incredibly fragile psychological reality of Camilla's position. She had waited decades in the wings. She had endured catastrophic public hatred. She had finally achieved the ultimate, impossible title of queen consort. Yet, when the late queen's final wishes were quietly executed, Camilla was reportedly left with virtually nothing of profound personal or financial significance from the private vault. The message was deafeningly loud, and it was a freezing slap to the face. You may have the title through marriage, but you do not have the blood, and you do not have the ultimate royal favor. Palace insiders immediately began whispering to the press, noting that while Catherine would never boast about it, the massive inheritance of the jewelry was a primary reason why Camilla deeply resented her stepdaughter-in-law. But this fury was not just born out of mere vanity or a desire for pretty diamonds. It was deeply rooted in a terrifying, cold financial reality. Despite her incredibly elevated status, Camilla's own personal net worth is estimated to be only around $5 million. To a normal person, that is a fortune. But in the ultra-exclusive billionaire stratosphere of the British royal family, $5 million is absolute pennies. It means that despite wearing a crown, Camilla is almost entirely dangerously dependent on the massive wealth of King Charles to maintain her lifestyle and her power. This glaring financial discrepancy terrified Camilla, not just for herself, but for her own bloodline. While Lady Louise and Princess Catherine were being quietly showered with multi-million-dollar inheritances and priceless historical artifacts, Camilla was watching her own children, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, remain entirely on the outside looking in. Her children possess absolutely zero royal blood. They will never organically inherit the grand estates or the ancient titles. This terrifying realization has reportedly pushed Camilla to heavily influence King Charles behind closed doors. Rumors have swirled relentlessly that she is desperately trying to solidify her own family's financial future within the king's eventual will, allegedly even attempting to completely diminish Prince Harry's future share to benefit her own son, Tom. She is fighting a desperate, uphill battle for status, wealth, and permanence in a family that still, fundamentally, views her bloodline as entirely common. And this is exactly why the quiet, unstoppable rise of someone like Lady Louise is so deeply infuriating to the Queen Consort's camp. Here is a young woman, a direct, undeniable descendant of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip. She possesses the pure, unadulterated royal bloodline. She has inherited the sentimental treasures, the horses, the carriages, and the undeniable affection of the late monarchs. Yet, in a move of staggering humility, Lady Louise actively chooses not to even use her Royal Highness title. Louise does not demand attention. She does not demand jewels. She does not demand a share of the spotlight. And because of that exact humility, she ended up walking away with the deepest, most genuine pieces of the royal legacy. It is a brilliant, poetic justice that drives the ambitious factions of the palace absolutely crazy. The jewelry war ultimately exposed the rawest truth of the monarchy. You can marry into a title, but you cannot marry into the true, historical soul of the family. But how exactly did Lady Louise turn out so remarkably grounded in a family famous for its bitter, highly public, and spectacularly messy feuds? The answer lies entirely with her parents, a couple who orchestrated the absolute smartest, most brilliant survival strategy in modern royal history. To fully comprehend how Lady Louise walked away with the most precious inheritances and the purest affection of the late queen, we have to pull back the lens and examine the brilliant, highly calculated survival strategy engineered by her parents. While the rest of the royal family was busy tearing each other apart in the global press, Prince Edward and Sophie, the current Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, were quietly executing the absolute smartest, most effective public relations masterclass in modern royal history. Let us look at the undeniable, messy reality of Queen Elizabeth's 4 children. Her eldest, King Charles, spent decades engulfed in catastrophic tabloid headlines, enduring a highly toxic, internationally broadcast divorce and a scandalous affair that nearly broke the monarchy. Her second son, Prince Andrew, dragged the crown into an unimaginable, catastrophic legal scandal that permanently destroyed his public life. Her only daughter, Princess Anne, while incredibly hardworking, was famously fierce, fiercely independent, and also went through a highly publicized divorce. But then there was the youngest child, Prince Edward. Edward was the quiet one. He was the son who caused his mother the absolute least amount of stress, and his most brilliant decision was the woman he chose to marry. In 1999, Edward married Sophie Rhys-Jones. Unlike the aristocratic brides who came before her, Sophie was a fiercely intelligent, self-made woman who had built a highly successful career in public relations. She understood the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of the British press better than anyone born inside the palace walls. For the first few years, she tried to balance her commercial career with her royal status, but after a few minor media hiccups, Sophie made a brilliant, highly strategic pivot in 2002. She completely abandoned her corporate career and threw her entire being into becoming a full-time, uncomplaining working royal. She quietly, relentlessly took on the patronage of over 70 different charitable organizations. She never demanded the front pages. She never complained about her grueling schedule. She never leaked venomous stories to the press to make herself look better. Because of this absolute, unbreakable loyalty, Sophie earned a highly coveted, fiercely protected title behind closed doors, palace insiders universally acknowledged her as the Queen's absolute favorite daughter-in-law. When the Queen lost her mother and her sister, it was Sophie who quietly stepped in to fill that agonizing emotional void. And it was within this bubble of profound trust that Edward and Sophie raised Lady Louise and her younger brother, James. Their parenting strategy was entirely revolutionary for the House of Windsor. In a world utterly consumed by paranoia, leaks, and bitter feuds, Edward and Sophie built an impenetrable fortress of normalcy. They lived at Bagshot Park, which, yes, is a staggering 120-room mansion nestled in Surrey. But inside those massive, echoing walls, it functioned like a remarkably normal, loving home. Sophie famously shared an incredibly revealing story with the press. When Louise was a young girl, she came home from school one day looking completely bewildered. She looked at her mother and said she was very confused because the other children kept telling her that her grandmother was the Queen. When Sophie asked her how that made her feel, Louise simply replied that she didn't understand. Louise literally had zero concept of her own immense historical privilege. To her, Elizabeth was not the sovereign ruler of a global commonwealth. She was just the sweet old lady who came over for afternoon tea. It was exactly this pure, unfiltered innocence that Queen Elizabeth cherished above all the gold in her vaults. Furthermore, Sophie publicly stated that she raised both of her children with the absolute, non-negotiable expectation that they would eventually have to work for a living. They would not be allowed to just coast on their royal bloodlines or demand multi-million-dollar taxpayer-funded security details. And Lady Louise proved this spectacular work ethic in a way that utterly stunned the British public. Just before heading off to university, instead of partying on luxury yachts in the Mediterranean or attending exclusive high society galas like her aristocratic peers, Lady Louise took a summer job. She quietly walked into a local garden center and started working. She stood behind a till, she pruned plants, she loaded bags of soil into customers' cars, and she earned standard minimum wage. This singular, incredibly humble act was a public relations triumph. It sharply, brilliantly contrasted with the toxic entitlement and endless complaining oozing from other, infinitely more famous branches of the royal family. It proved that Louise was grounded, relatable, and completely immune to the toxic narcissism of palace life. This extreme loyalty, this absolute lack of drama, and this flawless execution of duty did not go unnoticed by the highest powers in the land. The monarchy survives entirely on trust. And by 2023, King Charles made a monumental, highly emotional move that confirmed everything. He officially bestowed the legendary title of Duke of Edinburgh upon Prince Edward. This was Prince Philip's fiercely protected title. By giving it to Edward and elevating Sophie to Duchess, the king confirmed what the late Queen had known all along. This quiet, unassuming branch of the family had entirely earned the monarchy's absolute trust. With that ultimate trust came the elevation of their daughter. Lady Louise was no longer just the quiet granddaughter in the background. She was being carefully, meticulously positioned for something much bigger. As the monarchy faces a terrifying, unprecedented crisis of manpower, this young woman who worked at a garden center is secretly being groomed to become the ultimate savior of the crown. The spectacular masterclass in royal survival executed by her parents brings us to the ultimate, thrilling climax of Lady Louise's story. For years, the global public and even senior members of the royal family naturally assumed that because she was entirely sheltered, because she worked for minimum wage at a garden center, and because she actively refused to use her official Her Royal Highness title, she would simply fade away into the obscure, aristocratic background. They assumed she would become just another minor royal, living a quiet, irrelevant life in the countryside. They were completely, spectacularly wrong. Lady Louise was not fading away. She was quietly, meticulously preparing to step directly into the absolute center of the royal stage. The first major signal that a profound shift was occurring happened in September 2022. Just days after the devastating passing of her beloved grandmother, Lady Louise officially enrolled to study English at the highly prestigious University of St. Andrews in Scotland. For casual observers, this might just seem like a standard academic choice. But for royal insiders, this was a massive, flashing, neon sign. St. Andrews is the exact same historic institution where Prince William famously met Kate Middleton exactly 20 years prior. By walking those exact same ancient halls, Louise was silently aligning herself with the absolute core, the very heartbeat of the future monarchy. She was stepping into the exact same training ground that forged the current Princess of Wales. But her university choice was merely the prologue. The move that truly stunned royal watchers and sent absolute shockwaves through Buckingham Palace occurred in 2024. While her globally famous cousins across the ocean were busy filming reality television documentaries and giving explosive, highly paid media interviews, Lady Louise made an entirely different, drastically traditional choice. She voluntarily joined the Tayforth University Officer Training Corps, a highly demanding, intensely rigorous branch of the British Army Reserve. Suddenly, photographs began circulating that shattered her quiet, shy public image. The world saw Lady Louise, the Queen's favorite, tender-hearted granddaughter, completely decked out in heavy military camouflage. She was photographed wearing combat boots, her face covered in tactical green and black camouflage paint, and wearing a heavy military helmet with the name Windsor boldly stamped across the back. By 2025, she had officially elevated her status to become an officer cadet in the Army Reserve, enduring grueling physical training alongside completely regular, everyday citizens. To fully grasp the massive historical weight of this decision, you have to look directly at the defining moments of Queen Elizabeth's own life. Lady Louise's military journey is a chilling, beautiful, exact echo of her grandmother. During the darkest, most terrifying days of the Second World War, a young Princess Elizabeth, at just 16 years old, stepped forward to conduct her first official public duty by inspecting military troops at Windsor Castle. By the time she turned 18, Elizabeth defied the protective wishes of her father, the king, and successfully begged to join the Auxiliary Territorial Service. She learned how to deconstruct and rebuild heavy military truck engines, becoming the very first female member of the royal family to ever serve as an active duty member of the British Armed Forces. When Lady Louise put on that camouflage paint and that Windsor helmet, she was not just joining a university club. She was directly channeling the absolute, unbreakable wartime spirit of the sovereign. Prominent royal commentators, such as Richard Fitzwilliams, immediately noticed this breathtaking parallel. They pointed out that Louise is the ultimate, perfect hybrid of the two late monarchs. She possesses the quiet, understated, dutiful shyness of Queen Elizabeth, combined flawlessly with the fierce, competitive, unstoppable physical drive of Prince Philip. Her own professional networking profile suggests she is actively eyeing a serious, heavy-hitting career in the military, international diplomacy, or high-level law. She is not trying to build a lifestyle brand. She is not trying to launch a podcast. She is building an impenetrable resume of duty. And this brings us to the terrifying, mathematical reality currently suffocating Buckingham Palace, and why Lady Louise is the ultimate checkmate against the ambitious, jealous factions of the family. The modern British monarchy is currently sitting on top of a catastrophic demographic time bomb. Following the disastrous, highly public exits of Prince Harry and Prince Andrew and the aging of the senior generation, the ranks of the working royals have been completely decimated. King Charles originally wanted a slimmed-down monarchy, but what he currently has is a skeletal monarchy. Right now, there are only 4 full-time working royals under the age of 70. Let that terrifying reality sink in. Only 4 individuals under 70 years old are expected to carry the crushing weight of thousands of annual engagements, foreign tours, and charitable patronages. The institution is absolutely desperate for fresh, deeply reliable, entirely scandal-free young blood. While Queen Camilla and her fiercely ambitious inner circle may have spent the aftermath of the Queen's death furiously maneuvering for social status, better inheritance positioning, and ensuring that her non-royal son, Tom Parker Bowles, gets invited to the right palace events, they completely missed the bigger picture. They fought a bitter shadow war for access and jewelry. But Lady Louise, armed with nothing but extreme humility, a grueling work ethic, and a deep, genuine love for her grandparents, inherited something infinitely more valuable than diamonds. She inherited the actual future of the crown. The story of Lady Louise Windsor is the ultimate lesson in the mechanics of true power. Those who scream the loudest, demand the most titles, and fiercely guard their inherited wealth often end up exposing their own deep insecurities. But the ones who quietly do the work, who show up without demanding the spotlight, and who respect the heavy, historical weight of their bloodline, they are the ones who ultimately win the long game. The Queen knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't just giving away a green carriage or hiding her jewelry. She was quietly crowning the hidden star of the next generation. So, what do you think? Did Queen Elizabeth make the absolute right choice by quietly favoring Lady Louise over the more famous, dramatic members of the royal family? And do you believe Louise should officially step up and become a full-time working royal to save the fiercely understaffed monarchy? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, Hit that like button if you learned something new today, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss the deep, hidden truths behind the palace walls.